Clint Eastwood sat in his chair, leaning back, with a slight tension in his shoulders from the long journey. The airplane was filled with silence, broken only by the distant conversations of other passengers and the hum of the engines. Through the window, clouds could be seen, looking like soft, fluffy pillows in the endless blue sky. In his hands was a small metal cross, which he held as a symbol of inner strength, despite the fact that many didn't understand it. It seemed like nothing could disturb this calm. But at that moment, the stewardess approached. Her face looked cold, and there was a look in her eyes that Clint immediately noticed: stubbornness and determination. She was no longer just a stewardess, but a guardian of some obscure, yet important truth to her. "Excuse me, sir," her voice was low, with a hint of sternness, "but I must ask you to remove this cross." Clint raised an eyebrow in surprise. She continued, "We can't allow such religious symbols to be visible on board this aircraft. It's company policy." Clint didn't rush to respond. He slowly placed the cross on the armrest, staring directly into the stewardess's eyes. He could feel the atmosphere around them tense, and he understood that this woman had no intention of backing down. "It's just metal," he said calmly, without any aggression in his voice. "Nothing more." The stewardess held his gaze, and it seemed she was deciding whether or not to continue this confrontation. "It's not about what it is," her voice grew even colder. "It's about respecting the policy. And I have the right to ask you to remove it." Clint felt his patience beginning to wear thin, but instead of responding sharply, he quietly placed his hand on the cross and looked at her. Her persistence was obvious, but for him, it was a battle of nerves, and he had no intention of giving in on something that was important to him. "Explain to me why this is so important," he said, his gaze remaining calm, almost meditative. The stewardess seemed taken aback by the question. Her jaw clenched, and her eyes seemed to waver in doubt. "I can't allow this to be a violation of internal rules." Clint sighed heavily, his eyes becoming more serious, and he quietly spoke. "Do you really believe this is a violation?" Her gaze grew more nervous. She didn't answer, but everything was clear. There were no more words, only the tense silence that filled the small space between them. Clint didn't say another word. He slowly took the cross and tucked it into his pocket, never breaking his gaze from the stewardess. His movements were calm, but he knew that the situation had left a crack that was no longer so easy to fill. The stewardess sighed and silently walked away, leaving Clint in his deep thoughts. Clint took a brief pause, sitting in his chair, once again feeling the warm air of the cabin envelop him, but at the same time, he sensed that something had shifted in the atmosphere. He clenched his fist around the cross in his pocket, but remained calm. The stewardess's gaze stayed in his memory, and now everything seemed different. A few minutes later, when the plane had gained altitude again, the stewardess returned. She stood beside his seat with several other crew members, and her expression was even colder. Clint realized, she wasn't going to let this go. "Mr. Eastwood," her voice was firm and relentless. "I must warn you once more. This is not just about your religion, it's about the airline's policy. If you don't remove this cross, we will be forced to take more serious action." Clint raised his head and looked her in the eye. All this time, he had tried to ignore the situation, but now it was clear to him, she was trying to intimidate him. And that was wrong. "More serious action?" he asked, his voice growing cold and penetrating. "Do you really want this to escalate into a conflict? Are you trying to give me an ultimatum for believing in what is important to me?" The stewardess didn't back down. She was stubborn, and in her eyes, there was even a trace of anger she tried to hide. "I'm not giving you an ultimatum," her voice became sharp. "These are just the rules we have to follow. And if you refuse to comply, the consequences will be yours." Clint sat still, but his gaze was penetrating. He could feel the tension becoming more evident, even though the whole plane remained calm. Inside, everything was tearing apart. He was ready to see it through to the end. "Consequences," he repeated, stunned by her categorical tone. "Do you seriously think I'll remove this just because you told me to? I'm not going to comply with the whims of someone who can't even explain why this policy exists. Her gaze became more sinister, and she took a step forward, almost closing the distance between them, as if ready for a direct confrontation. You don't understand that this isn't just about you. This is about rules that apply to everyone. Your religion can't interfere with another policy, can it? It's just a little thing. And for me, it's not a little thing, Clint responded, his voice changing, becoming firm and clear. You want me to take off something that I consider important because it contradicts your standards? I respect your right to believe in whatever you want. But why should my beliefs be dismissed just because they don't align with yours? What's left of human dignity if each of us has to strip away everything that matters to us in order to not break someone else's rules? The stewardess froze in place. For a few seconds, she couldn't respond, and those few seconds seemed endless. The whole plane was silent, as if every passenger was waiting for the resolution of this conflict. I don't know why you're so upset, she said, a little calmer. It's just a cross. It's more than just a cross, Clint held her gaze, never looking away. It's a symbol of my right to be myself, no matter where I am. Her face began to change, first anger, then surprise. Clint felt he had penetrated her mind. She probably hadn't expected such a reaction, such determination from him. I understand, the stewardess took a few steps back, her voice slightly trembling. This wasn't personal. I didn't mean to offend you. Clint didn't reply, just slowly stood up, looking at her. You can still change your attitude. I'm not trying to be your enemy, I just want us to be honest with each other. This cross is not just a symbol for me. It's a part of who I am. The stewardess stood silently, looking at him, and it seemed that this moment was a turning point for her. Clint's eyes bore into hers, unyielding. The cabin was almost suffocatingly silent, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air like thick fog. She hadn't expected this kind of resistance, and it rattled her. She took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation, but Clint wasn't making it easy. I don't think you understand, she said, her voice cold again but trembling slightly. This isn't about what you believe. It's about what's acceptable on this flight. You're not special. Everyone here follows the rules. Clint's grip tightened around the cross in his pocket, but he didn't move. His face was stone, his voice even harder than before. I am special, he said, low and deliberate. We all are. And we have a right to stand for something. You don't get to tell me what's acceptable to believe. You may enforce these rules, but you can't erase my convictions. Her eyes flashed with irritation. She took a step closer, not backing down, her uniform pristine, yet her hands were starting to tremble. You think your convictions give you the right to disrupt this flight? Her tone sharpened. You're causing a scene. You've already been warned once. Don't test me, Clint. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. The words hit him like a punch, but Clint didn't flinch. His voice was the only thing that remained calm, ice in his veins. I'm not the one causing a scene here. You're the one who's escalating it. I'm just sitting here, holding on to what matters to me. But apparently, that's too much for you. The standoff continued, the tension crackling between them. She wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Every word that passed between them felt like a battle, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Maybe, she said, her voice now tight with frustration, this is about more than just your beliefs. Maybe it's about showing respect for others. You're not the only one on this plane. This is a shared space, and the rules are here for a reason. Clint's lips curled into a bitter smile. Respect? You want me to respect the rules that strip away my identity? You think this is about respecting others? Because right now, it feels like you're telling me to erase who I am for the sake of your rules. The cabin felt suffocating now. All eyes were on them, even if no one dared to speak up. Her chest tightened, the silence screaming louder than their words. Clint wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to give in to the pressure. "Enough," she snapped, her hand shooting up, a clear sign of authority. "I warned you. If you don't remove that cross, I will have to report this. And you won't like the consequences." Clint's heart raced, but his voice didn't waver. "You can report me. But you can't take away what I believe." The standoff was palpable. The whole flight seemed to hold its breath, unsure of what was going to happen next. Would he be escorted off? Would this escalate into something even uglier? The tension stretched on, each second more unbearable than the last. Clint's mind raced, the stakes now higher than ever. And then, as if on cue, the flight attendants behind her started murmuring, and the rest of the passengers shifted uneasily. No one wanted to witness this confrontation, but there was no turning back now. The entire cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable spark to ignite. The stewardess' gaze softened for a brief moment, but Clint wasn't fooled. Her lips tightened, and she stepped back, signaling the others. "This isn't over," she said, her voice now laced with barely concealed anger. "I'll be reporting this incident. And don't think you'll get away with it." Clint didn't respond, but his eyes never left hers. As she turned and stormed off, the weight of the moment lingered in the air like smoke. The battle wasn't over. But for now, Clint had won. At least for this moment, his beliefs were his own, unbroken by anyone else. The stewardess stormed off, but the tension in the cabin remained. Clint could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, some curious, others judging. The silence was thick, oppressive, and for a moment, he almost questioned whether standing his ground had been worth it. A few moments passed, but it felt like an eternity. Then, the intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice smooth but filled with a subtle undertone of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated and calm while we resolve a minor issue. Your cooperation is appreciated." Clint's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the anger of the stewardess still in the air, like an electric charge waiting to spark. He didn't move, didn't look away. His grip on the cross tightened again, his only anchor in this strange, escalating drama. He wasn't about to be intimidated. As if on cue, two more flight attendants arrived, one of them a man, tall with dark hair and a stern expression. He looked Clint over, assessing the situation. Without a word, the man sat down beside him, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering. "Sir," the man began, his voice low but firm. "We've received reports from the cabin crew that you're refusing to comply with flight regulations." Clint didn't flinch. "I'm not refusing anything. I've explained my position. I'm not taking off my cross. No one should be forced to." The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "You're causing disruption. People are uncomfortable. We don't want to escalate this further, but we will if necessary." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Disruption? You're the one escalating this, not me. You're telling me to remove something that is part of who I am. You're telling me to deny my beliefs, just to make everyone else comfortable. But that's not how the world works. Not anymore." The flight attendant sighed, clearly trying to keep his patience. "I understand your position, but this isn't about beliefs. It's about the rules of the flight. We have a responsibility to ensure a safe and peaceful environment for all passengers. The crew has a duty to enforce that." "And what about my duty to myself?" Clint's voice was steady, but the words hung in the air, cutting through the tension. "Am I supposed to strip away my identity just because it makes some people uneasy? Where does that end? Where do you draw the line?" The stewardess from before reappeared, flanked by another attendant. Her face was flushed, but her eyes were cold, cutting through Clint with sharp precision. "You're being unreasonable," she said, her voice low and tight. "This isn't a debate. This is a policy. You either remove the cross, or we'll take further action." Clint could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him again, some of them silently rooting for him, others uncomfortable with the confrontation. The plane felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The hum of the engine, once a comforting sound, now felt like a distant buzz. Clint leaned forward, locking eyes with the stewardess. "And what's the consequence if I don't? You're threatening to take me off the plane, right? You think that will make everything better?" She stepped closer, voice dangerously low. "You don't want to test me, Mr. Eastwood. This is a flight, not a courtroom. We have the authority to handle situations like this. And if you think it's about your cross, you're mistaken. It's about your defiance." Clint's eyes flickered, but he didn't back down. "It's about me standing up for what I believe in. It's about you trying to crush something that's been part of me for longer than you've been alive. This isn't just a cross, it's a symbol. And I won't let you take that from me." She didn't respond immediately. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the quiet murmur of the other passengers, the flight attendants shifting uncomfortably. Then, she finally spoke again, her voice tight but resigned. "Fine. You win for now. But don't think this is over. I'll report this, and you'll have to deal with the consequences when we land." Clint's heart still pounded, but there was a flicker of victory in his chest. He hadn't given in. He hadn't been broken. He nodded slowly. "I'll deal with it. But know this, I'm not the one causing a problem here. You are." She turned away, her heels clicking sharply on the floor, as the others followed her, leaving Clint alone with his thoughts. His hands still trembled, but his heart was steady. The confrontation wasn't over, and he knew the fight would continue. But for now, he had held his ground. As the flight attendants retreated, the atmosphere seemed to settle, though the tension still lingered in the cabin like a thick fog. Clint sat back in his seat, his fingers gripping the armrest, his heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. His mind raced, but there was a sense of quiet triumph now, he hadn't backed down. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. The stewardess, who had been the most insistent, never returned to Clint's section. The others, though cordial, kept their distance, casting him wary glances whenever they thought he wasn't looking. As the plane began its descent, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. The landing was smooth, but his thoughts were far from it. He had known the risks of standing firm, but now, with the threat hanging over him, he wasn't sure what awaited him when the plane touched down. When the plane finally landed and the seatbelt sign went off, Clint stood up, his legs stiff from the long flight. He felt the eyes of the passengers still on him, some curious, others judgmental. As he reached for his carry-on, the flight attendant from earlier reappeared, her expression a mix of cold professionalism and something deeper, perhaps disdain, perhaps resignation. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the cabin. "Please follow me." Clint didn't hesitate. He walked with her down the narrow aisle, the eyes of every passenger tracking his every move. The flight attendants around him kept their distance, but Clint could sense the undercurrent of judgment. They reached the door, and the stewardess motioned toward a small side room. Clint followed her inside, where another airline officer was waiting, a stern man in a uniform. "Mr. Eastwood," the officer said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We've had a complaint from the crew. We're going to need to resolve this issue." Clint stood his ground, his chest rising with each breath. "I'm not removing my cross. I've already explained that." The officer's eyes flickered with impatience. "You're free to express your beliefs, but not at the expense of the flight's safety or the comfort of others. You'll be receiving a report for non-compliance, and we'll be escalating this to the proper authorities." Clint clenched his fists, his anger bubbling to the surface once again. "What you're doing is wrong. This is my right. You don't get to decide what's acceptable just because it makes you uncomfortable." The officer's face tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "You'll be escorted off the premises. We've already made arrangements for you. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll be forced to take further action." Clint's mind raced. Was it worth it? Would this confrontation cost him more than it was worth? But deep down, he knew the answer. It wasn't just about the cross anymore. It was about standing up for what he believed was right, for not letting anyone dictate his sense of self. He nodded slowly, his gaze unflinching. "I'll leave. But know this fight isn't over. You may have won this round, but you'll see that standing up for what's right is never as easy as it seems." The officer said nothing, but the stewardess gave Clint one last cold look before turning away. He walked out of the room, his heart heavy but resolute. As he stepped into the airport terminal, the weight of the situation settled in. The world had changed, and it wasn't going to be easy to navigate. But Clint knew one thing for certain: he hadn't backed down. And as long as he could stand firm in his beliefs, that was all that mattered. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a road he was prepared to walk. With his head held high, Clint walked toward the exit, ready to face whatever came next.